Scarlet fever. We're going to be looking at scarlet fever in depth today. So, Streptococcus pyogenes. It's also known as, besides scarlet fever, it's known as scarlatina. It affects the immune system, your skin. It's an acute disease caused by bacterial infections. Usually there's sore throat, fever, rash, a flushed face, sometimes with a goosebump looking area. And a lot of times you'll see this described as if like someone took your face and slapped your face and left red whelps here, and then there was a white area across your mustache area here and around the mouth here in the face. That's how it's described a lot of times. Okay, so a little bit about the history of scarlet fever. It had been back in around 1860, they had determined that it was distinguished from measles and other rash-producing diseases, that there was a difference. Later, a Russian scientist linked its cause to Streptococcus. It wasn't until 1924 when George and Gladys Dick, he was in World War I in the medical corps, and he was a physician, and he was the head of medicine at the University of Chicago. And he and his wife isolated the Streptococcus bacteria and the causes of scarlet fever by preparing a toxin. They call it the Dick toxin, used for immunization. So this method of prevention for the disease is now called the Dick skin test for scarlet fever. So despite the decline in the incidence of these toxins mediated, the diseases over the past century have become very high in countries that don't have as high an income. So the group A Staphylococcus is still among the top 10 infectious causes of human mortality, with more than 500,000 deaths annually. I wanted to show you a little bit about the taxonomy of the Streptococcus, and you can see that the domain is bacteria, the kingdom's bacteria, the phylum Firmicutes, the class Bacilla, all the way down to the genus here on the slide. And if you look over to the left, which is just one of the branches of the phylogenetic tree, you'll see when it comes, if you can see my arrow, when it comes up and to the left, you'll see the bacilli branching off, and then about halfway up underneath the firmicules, here is where you'll find the Streptococcus, about halfway down there on the taxonomy list of the phylogenetic tree. Okay, so the Streptococcus is a gram-positive aerotolerant bacterium in the genus Streptococcus. So the bacteria are extracellular, and they're made up of non-motile and non-sporing cocci. So they are very important for humans, and it's usually pathogenic, and it's part of the skin microbia. And if you'll look to the right, you will see a highly magnified actual photograph of the Streptococcus pyogenes that causes scarlet fever. And this is also the same one that causes strep throat. And then over on the left, you can actually see the breakdown of the cell, where the cell membrane is, the capsule, where the extracellular substances are located, just a very brief diagram of the structure of Streptococcus. Okay, so the Streptococcus, we know it causes strep throat. The same Streptococcus pyogenes causes strep throat as well as scarlet fever, which makes sense. A lot of it's right here in this throat area. So the A Streptococcus group makes this poison, and that poison is what causes the rash or the scarlet part of the fever. So, you know, some of our bacterias are non-pathogenic, which are just naturally in our body, and then are those that are pathogenic, which is what this is. The incubation period is 2 to 5 days. Some publications say 2 to 4 days. And we know that it's followed by chills, fever, fiery red, mucosa, abscesses in the tonsils, the lymphs, the bright red tongue with the white on it. That's usually called the raspberry tongue. And usually 3 days after all of this appears is when the rash will dominantly be on the trunk of the body, the insides of the arms, the insides of the legs, maybe even involving the face, but not the small area around the mouth. That is still usually white. So the rash will usually go away in about the first week. And we do know there is an acute inflammatory reaction that happens in the lymph nodes. But we do know that by taking the antibiotic therapy that we can reduce the amount of time that someone would suffer down to about a week as opposed to 3 weeks. So we know that they have looked at different genes in the Streptococcus bacteria, and they're actually in a new publication that was out in September of this year, 2019. They're actually saying that scarlet fever is changing its spots, meaning that genetically it is changing. So there is some scholarly journals recently published in the last few days talking about this, how it has started to evolve and the genetic makeup of some of the strains are starting to be different. So the most at-risk population for scarlet fever are children ages 1 to 10 years old. So it can impact teenagers and adults as well, but children are more likely to get it. Around 10% of the population will become infected by the group A strep bacteria, but only 10% of those people will develop full-blown scarlet fever. So it should be noted that the A strep bacteria can cause other diseases and illnesses too, such as pink eye and strep throat. Pink eye is so much fun, so is strep throat. Additionally, boys and girls are usually at risk, and there's no race or ethnicity that seems to be at a greater risk than one another. The reason that children are more likely to develop scarlet fever is that most people by the age of 10 have developed the necessary antibodies to protect them against the illness. Antibodies are the protein molecules that form in your blood that are used to kill and destroy the various bacteria and viruses that might enter into the body that cause illnesses. So the group A strep bacteria are airborne, meaning that they are transmitted through the air by coughing or sneezing, and it can also be transmitted by things such as sharing drinks, utensils, kissing an infected person, much how the common cold or the flu is spread. It is considered an infectious disease that produces a toxin, and it usually colonizes in the throat or on the skin. It will most commonly occur in association with pharyngitis, but it can also result from infections at other sites, including wound infections. So it releases the toxins, and they result in the characteristic fever and rash. Management, it's highly contagious, and if not treated with an antimicrobial, it can be infectious for 2 to 3 weeks. Gotta fly. It can remain for 24 hours after starting the treatment. That could be quite miserable. So transmission occurs directly person to person, and the incubation period could be 2 to 5 days. And one of the reasons that the same disease is also, or the same microbe is also causes strep throat is because the streptococcus will get into the epithelial cells in the throat, and there it is allowed to grow. It's kind of like it's a carriage internalized, and it just really thrives in that situation. So the signs and symptoms, we talked about these a little bit already, but I wanted to show you a picture of a child's back that has scarlet fever. So we talked about the red sore throat fever, swollen lymph nodes, red, rough rash, and throat infection, and then what appears to be this rash that will break out like on the torso or the inner parts of the arms and the legs. So it is imperative when a physician is looking at a child to actually even check below the underwear line for signs of this. So the treatment. The treatment is to reduce the symptoms and complications, and scarlet fever are generally acceptable to antibiotics. And right now, even though it's treated sometimes with other antibiotics, penicillin seems to be the go-to treatment. And there are some people that are allergic, so there are other options out there. But the group A streptococcus so far has not been penicillin resistant in clinical trials. A few days after the body temperature returns to normal, peeling off of the skin takes place at the site of the rash, especially on the hands and the feet. And it can also cause ear infections, rheumatic fever, pneumonia, and kidney inflammation. So people should always be giving plenty of fluids and acetaminophen to reduce the discomfort, salt water gargles, lozenges, using a humidifier, and the spread of the infection can be greatly reduced with frequent hand washing to avoid the shared use of utensils, drinking glasses, and linens. So first of all, you're probably wondering, on prevention, can scarlet fever kill you? Well, yeah, it can interfere with your breathing and swelling of the pharynx, and it can kill you by causing a blood infection, sepsis. And the fever can result in severe dehydration, which can be fatal to infants and young children. And if, well, let's just look at some of the things. Okay, we know it's strep A. We know people get sick if they breathe in these droplets, they touch something that have the droplets on them, they drink from the same glass or utensils, they touch sores on the skin. This is probably something children would do, like the impetigo. Rarely it's spread through food, but if it's not handled properly, that is a possibility. And even though it's not real likely, pets, household items, toys, etc., can spread the bacteria. I found it really interesting, though, that scarlet fever is increased in the north and the east part of Asia since 2011, and it's become a global health problem, and I hadn't even really heard much about it. And there's also been outbreaks in Germany in May of 2018 that exceeded England and Hong Kong. So in 2017, the United Kingdom reported that their highest outbreak that they'd had in 50 years. So earlier this year, scarlet fever outbreaks in China looked at the genetic characteristics of the predominant group A streptococcus that they had here, the EMM12 isolates. And they thought that that diversity in that EMM12 gene expanded from a single cloning lineage to a multi-cloning. However, the study was inconclusive and it didn't show that to be true. And the other hypothesis that they had in China was the fact that in 2011 that they had unofficially gone to more than a one child per family system, and it had been extended to 2 children. But that was not proven either, because that was actually in the same year, and the subsequent years after that would have had to also show the same information. But it was an interesting theory. And then we also know that if you want to look at environmental things that have happened overseas in some of these countries, might have to do with the amount of, they show that there was a significant association between the nitrogen oxide, rainfall, sunshine, the relative humidity, showed that all of these things had an adverse effect on scarlet fever in their country. So, pollutants might increase the incidence of scarlet fever, and they might help to guide the way we could target programs for the intervention of this in countries that have a lot of pollution. So if we looked at population analysis further that support scarlet fever from different geological regions, evolving independently, and associate them with different characteristics, the data shows that a multiple mechanism related to carriage and expression characteristics probably do play a key role in the global disease outcomes. So the continuing increase in scarlet fever and invasive disease notification in the UK clearly stated that we need to install global surveillance systems and address the increases of A. streptococcus disease as a public health priority. And I also have some slides I'm going to show you next. I just found this was really interesting. Okay, this is England, and you can see in blue during week 13 how many more cases of scarlet fever in 2013 popped up. And then this is also in England, and this was like 10.7 cases per 100,000 population. But look all across their country. See, isn't that amazing? And I haven't heard anything on the news about that. My question is, should we be more diligent on educating people here about the outbreaks of scarlet fever globally, and can it influence us here? These are the different works that I cited working on this paper. Thank you.